So how can communities, communities of belonging, communities of that narrow way, draw the contemporary soul? Some post-war communities, such as L'Arche, which the word means the ark, as in we're all in the same boat, we belong in this together, and post-war, whose inhabitants are survivors from the ruins of the world. Some of those communities aimed to invite people from often privileged backgrounds to live alongside those the early community referred to as the poor, the rejected, those who the world sees as least, a vision contra nequitam et insidious diaboli of the 1930s extremism that grew out of the economic crisis of the late 1920s. And when people are in pain and frightened, they will blame others. They will blame the vulnerable. They will identify enemies that they didn't need to before. Now, the sulphur speech of that extreme evil was that people with disabilities were worthless and should be destroyed. Thus, the radical gospel response post-war seemed to draw humanity's heart in the opposite direction, back towards God, to a place where the world could see and live the value and beauty of people with learning difficulties, and learn from them, delight in, treasure their capacity to teach us love. The community life that followed meant that generosity in the ego-boosting sense was unacceptable. Offering one's kindness from a high, secure tower that only isolated the soul in an egotistical generosity. Rather, these lay communities felt that only by letting aspirations of career success collapse into a different view of what being human and the value of human actually is, would be to conform their lives and therefore the world to Christ. And this ideal came under strain in the 1990s as the demands of professionalism led to community members needing to develop their professional abilities. This meant not just going to work each day with the poor, but actually living alongside them in small rooms in shared community houses in the early days, even sharing those small rooms as concepts of personal space, so essential to our modern way of thinking, became meaningless. To some extent, the new, looser, semi-monastic and apostolic communities founded in the 20th century continue to sustain their shared lives as the ancient ways wane, as the ancient communities pass, despite the more transient stays of lay communities and the expectation of lifelong commitment from the latter. The lifelong commitment of the Benedictine charism to one house is to anchor the soul to the lifelong work of conversation, yes, and conversion and repentance, that conversation in the inward self, that conversation of prayer, sacra conversatione. And these are journeys not of self-flagellation, but of conversation, of conversion, of using the gift of being alive to bring out more deeply the gift of love created in the soul. Thus, what the rule says is not about self-destruction, but about opening the community member's heart to suffering, damaged humanity. The seventh degree of humility is that he consider himself lower and of less account than anyone else, and this not only in verbal protestation, but also with the most heartfelt inner conviction. There is in the Benedictine rule a beautiful compassion and practicality. Let the abbot, says chapter 27, be most solicitous in his concern, secretly console the wavering brother and induce him to make humble satisfaction, comforting him that he may not be overwhelmed by excessive grief. 2 Corinthians 2.7, 2 verse 7. Likewise, there is a quiet practicality in the rule, the spirit of conserving what we've been given, and of being alive, abundantly alive, to thankfulness. Any true vocation, therefore, begins when the walls of the heart fall. God has been calling and the heart has been resisting, but there comes a time when the soul stops resisting love and its own capacity for love, and the love of God fills one like living water. Once the self has been firmly matured in love, it is able to love and accept the fall of the ego implied in the daily little deaths of monastic life and service to the community, part of the wonderful creativity of sanctification, a process also given by God through the sanctification of time in the hours. In community, the old protective self-life and self-time dies, to be replaced by eternity and the daily.